This is the story of United Airlines Flight 132. On February 1989, a DC-10 was flying from Denver to Chicago with 274 people on board. The flight took off at 12:06 p.m. and after the passengers had been served their meals, it was time for coffee and tea. The cabin crew prepared the trolley with beverages and moved through the cabin offering them to the passengers. It was routine for the flight attendant to move through the cabin in this manner, moving from row to row, but they were actually doing something that was far from routine. They had no idea that their actions would be crucial to saving all 274 lives. The flight attendant offered drinks to the passengers in first class and then moved to coach. She started at the rear of the plane and made her way forward. But when she reached seat 3 to B, the passenger there didn't want anything, so she moved on. Unbeknownst to them, that decision would play a key role in what happened next. At 1:16 p.m., the pilot noticed that the EGT or exhaust gas temperature of engine No. 3 was going up. This meant that the engine was overheating. He immediately contacted air traffic control and requested a course change. As he banked the aircraft away from the other two engines, he knew that if the engine failed, it would suck the other two engines into the now overly powerful jet stream of engine No. 3. The pilots knew that the only way to save the plane was to ditch the engine. And so at 1:23 p.m., the captain shut down engine No. 3. But here's where things got bad. As the third engine was producing more thrust than it should, it caused the plane to swerve to the right. But even worse things were about to happen. The inertial navigation system, which keeps track of a plane's movement and position, was affected by the sudden increase and then decrease in thrust from the plane's engines. Because of this, the system thought that the plane was diving to the right and sent signals to the pilots to correct for it. It told them to bank the plane to the left, but as the plane had already banked to the left to avoid the other two engines, this command meant that the plane would be banking to the left of the engines. The plane's nose began to drop. The pilots fought to keep the plane steady, but it was clear that they needed to land the plane immediately. But they had a problem. The closest airport was Rockford, which was just 87 miles away. But with the amount of fuel that they had left and the weight of the plane, they wouldn't make it there. But even if they did, the airport was under a blanket of snow. No one could land on the runway. The pilots knew that they had to keep flying. They managed to contact Chicago Air Traffic Control and were vectored towards the airport. The pilots were low on fuel, but somehow they managed to keep the plane airborne. Then, out of nowhere, the ground proximity warning system activated. The plane was too low. The pilots pushed the throttles forward, increasing engine power, and started to climb away from the terrain warning. They were now over Lake Michigan. There was water below them and nowhere else to go. The pilots continued to look for airports, but there weren't any. With the snowstorm raging outside, no one could land. One of the pilots spotted an opening in the clouds below him and decided to go for it. He banked the plane to the left and dove through the clouds. If he came out of the clouds and there was no runway below him, they'd have to ditch the plane into Lake Michigan. He pushed the landing gear lever down and waited. He looked down and saw a glimmer of hope. A long stretch of land appeared below him. It was a narrow peninsula jutting out into the lake. It was a long shot, but it might just be enough. The pilot knew that there wasn't much fuel left. He pushed the plane to its limits, putting the plane into a high-speed descent. The plane hit the runway at 1:53 p.m. The main landing gear collapsed on impact, but the plane kept going. The nose will touch down hard, but it held. The plane was on the ground. The pilots had done it. They landed the plane with just 1,000 pounds of fuel left. As soon as the plane came to a stop, the passengers erupted into cheers. They had survived. But that was the end of the story, because the plane had landed in a sparsely populated area. It was going to take some time before anyone found the crash site. And with winter fast approaching, temperatures would soon plummet to below zero. The passengers knew that they had to get out of the plane quickly. As soon as the emergency exit signs illuminated, the passengers started making their way to the exits. Many of them waddled off the plane and onto the snow-covered ground. Some others who hadn't buckled their seat belts during the crash couldn't get out of the plane. The passengers on the left side of the plane had it easy as they could simply open the emergency exit and slide down the inflatable chute. Those on the right side of the plane didn't have it so easy. They had to wait for emergency personnel to get to them. When emergency personnel arrived, they brought hot blankets to the survivors. By that time, the temperature had dropped to 32 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time everyone was accounted for, the death toll had risen to 3. 3 people had been unable to get out of the plane in time and had succumbed to exposure. But that could have been much worse. All 271 people on board had survived. But how did those flight attendants manage to save so many lives? You see, when the plane went down, many of the passengers were buckled in their seats. But there were still quite a few people walking around the cabin who had either unbuckled their seat belts or were never buckled in the first place. That's where the flight attendants came in. They waddled down the aisle and helped buckle in the passengers. They even went as far as helping passengers put on their oxygen masks. Their actions likely saved many lives. But this accident didn't just make headlines because of the survival of everyone on board. It also raised a lot of questions as to how a minor engine problem turned deadly. The NTSB launched a huge investigation into the crash. They wanted to find out why such a small issue turned into such a disaster. The first thing that they looked at was the engine. After all, it was the engine failure that caused the crash, or so they thought. But the engine turned out to be in perfect working order. The engine had been maintained properly and there were no issues with it. The real issue was the cassette containment system. This system was supposed to keep the fan blades inside the engine. But in this case, it had failed, allowing a blade to come loose, and that led to the overheating. But what caused the system to fail? Well, that's what the investigators were trying to figure out. It took them months of investigating, but they eventually figured out that the issue had been caused by fatigue damage. This fatigue damage had allowed the bolts to loosen over time, leading to the eventual failure. How did the bolts become loose in the first place? That was simple human error. The bolts had been improperly tightened during a maintenance check. But that wasn't the only human error that had almost brought down this plane. In the cockpit, the pilots were also making mistakes. As we mentioned earlier, the pilots were forced to ditch the engine. But here's where they messed up. They should have dumped the fuel from the center tank first, but they forgot to do so. This meant that when they landed, the plane had way too much fuel on board. That's why they ran out of runway. They should have dumped the excess fuel before attempting to land. If they had done that, they would have had enough runway to spare to stop safely. In fact, they had so much fuel on board that it broke a hole in the seawall, spraying fuel into the air and causing a massive fire. Now, imagine if this had happened today. In today's world, there would have been pictures and videos of this all over social media. Who knows what kind of panic it would cause? So what's the lesson here? Well, it's important to remember that every small part of an operation matters. In this case, it was the improperly installed fan blades that caused the whole thing to start. But it was the small decisions along the way that determined the outcome. For example, the decision to serve coffee and tea before the crash is what allowed the flight attendants to help buckle in the passengers. If they had served drinks after the crash, then those passengers would likely have died. Another thing is that the pilots made small mistakes that almost cost them everything. But sometimes those small mistakes can be the difference between life and death. What do you think? Could you survive an engine failure like this? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, don't forget to like the video.